a global primatology virtual conference held by Central Washington University. My name is Calvin Cardwell, and I'll be moderating the session today. This session is with Dr. Kirsty Graham and will last until 11 a.m. Pacific time. Before we start, I wanted to let you all know that this session will be recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, just shut off your camera. Additionally, to make this a fun learning experience for everyone involved, I'm going to request that we follow a few session rules. One, only one person speaking at a time just makes it difficult with more people speaking at once. And this is a safe space, so don't feel discouraged. Everybody's welcome to engage and ask questions. One question at a time, or one question per person, please, just to keep everything under wraps. And only speak for yourself, no one else. No name calling, derogatory comments. If you do anything like that, I'll kick you out and you'll be terminated from the session. And just please make sure to keep the chat clear of traffic and only for questions. So now that we're all on the same page, it's time to introduce Dr. Kirsty Graham, a research fellow at the University of St. Andrews in the United Kingdom studying great ape gestures. Dr. Graham is also a member of the Animal Behavior Collective, which organizes microgrants and mentorships for students studying animal behavior. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kirsty Graham.
Hi. So we'll just have a short, awkward moment while I share my screen, but that's just part of how we do things these days. Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to give this talk. I'm mostly going to be talking about bonobo gestures, and hopefully some useful stuff too. So I was going through this presentation over the last couple of days and thinking about, like, as a student organized conference, like what is useful for students, because you can read my papers about bonobo gestures, and I'll show you some fun bonobo videos and everything, but like career stuff's really helpful, like resources for job boards, for funding agencies, those kinds of things. So I've tried to include some useful stuff too. You'll notice on my title slide that there is another name that I'll be using for bonobo throughout, and that name is Bilia. And this is the name used for bonobos throughout a lot of their range in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where bonobo is a name that was taken from like a town from which samples were sent. The word bilia is more appropriate to use because it represents like how actual people refer to them throughout most of where they live. I also wanted to just make a quick nod to the fact that going through my research journey, I realized recently that I haven't had a whole lot of queer role models. And I also haven't had a whole lot of socialist role models. So if you're looking for either of those things, hi. And so part of like what I'm gonna front load this presentation with refers a little bit to both of that work. I threw this slide in here earlier today because I think through the pandemic and through the last year in particular, it's been quite a fruitful year for thinking about alternative systems under which we could live, because capitalism isn't working for us. It's not working ecologically. It's not working economically. It's not working for all of the people and all of the animals that live on this earth. And there's been a lot of talk in our institutions about decolonization. And I know that in primatology, particularly, there has been more of a push for decolonization. But what does that sort of work really look like? When our institutions talk about decolonization, a lot of what they'll talk about is diversifying reading lists, diversifying invited speakers, which is like, it's diversity and equality work, but it's not really getting to the roots of the problems and the colonialism within our institutions. What we need to be thinking about instead, and what our institutions need to do. We need to abolish entry exams that limit who can access our institutions. We need to abolish tuition fees, which are also a big barrier for people accessing higher education. We should forgive student debt, divest from imperial projects. So our universities shouldn't be investing in oil projects. They shouldn't be investing in all of these other types of, yeah, for like these neo-colonial infrastructures. There should be cultural restitution. Our institutions have taken so many cultural objects from people around the world, and they need to be returned. We also need to return land, particularly given this talk in North America. Land return is I mean, it's an elephant in the room. We need to pay reparations. So like there's all of these things that our institutions need to be working on when we talk about decolonization. We need to be supporting workers' rights. I know there are a lot of universities across the US right now who are in various labor disputes, and we need to support them. And we need to fundamentally reimagine what universities are and who they serve. So like this is a long list and this is a lot of work to do. And I wanted to start my presentation talking about this because throughout the presentation, I am going to be giving advice on here are job boards that you can find. And here are funding agencies who will give you money. And like, here's how you get it. Like, here's how you connect with a mentor. And all of these things that are things that can help you as an individual within this system that's actually quite messed up. And so I wanted to acknowledge like what we're working with to sort of front load the advice that I'm going to be offering throughout this presentation. So how did I get into research and how did I get into Bonobo Research? After finishing my undergraduate in 2012, started applying for field assistant positions. I ended up getting an unpaid field assistant position to study bonobo gestures at Wamba in the Democratic Republic of the Congo for about 6 months. I say this was an unpaid field assistant position. I urge senior researchers who are attending this talk to build salaries into their grants. And we really need to be pushing all funding bodies to fund research assistant salaries because this is a real barrier. And like I was privileged enough to be able to, I worked and I saved, but I was like also had an underlying privilege that allowed me to do this unpaid field assistant job. So there are a couple of job boards that I recommend for anyone who's looking at research experience. There are paid positions on these sites as well. So Primate InfoNet is an excellent resource for finding jobs in primatology. The Society for Conservation Biology also has a really helpful job board if you're looking for a conservation focus. So this was how I first got into studying bonobo gestures. And I wanted to acknowledge all of the people and all of the collaborators who have made this research possible. There's a lot of people who go who goes into a research project, and I want to thank all of my collaborators. All right, bonobo gestures. All great apes use gestures to communicate. Humans use gestures. I gesture a lot. I'm gesturing right now. Bonobos use gestures, chimpanzees use gestures, orangutans use gestures, gorillas use gestures, all great apes use gestures to communicate. And a gesture, the way we define a gesture is that it's a movement of the limbs, the head, the body, and it's not mechanically effective. So the example that I normally give is that if I reach to my water bottle and pick it up, that's a mechanically effective action. That's not a gesture. If I were to reach towards my water bottle and look at one of you and you were to pick it up and pass me my water bottle, that reach would have been a gesture. So that was a communicative action and it wasn't mechanically effective. So in this, so here there's an adult male bonobo who turns towards an adult female. And he shakes his hand like this. So this is like an arm shake or a handshake gesture. And there is a huge overlap in the gesture types that great apes use. So for my PhD work, I catalogued the gesture types used by bonobos, by Belia, and I found around 70 gesture types. And when I compared them with chimpanzees, they used around 90% of the same gestures. So I say around 90% because when compared to chimpanzees at Budongo in Uganda, they used 88% of the same gestures. But when we included chimpanzees at Bosu in Guinea, they used 96% of the same gesture types. So they have just this incredibly high overlap in the gesture types that they use. We're categorizing gesture types based on sort of and actions. So we might have an arm raise or an arm shake or an arm swing. So for sort of the 1,000 gesture instances we observe, we're able to categorize them into these sort of based on their physical form. So yeah, absolutely incredible gesture overlap between chimpanzees and bonobos. And so I just wanted to show a couple of videos to illustrate the similarity of these gesture types. So in the top left, there is a young Alia who's called Kyoto, and he does this arm raise gesture. And then in the bottom right corner, there's a chimpanzee at Bodongo who does the same arm raise gesture. And so when we're comparing these gesture repertoires, we're also looking for inter-observer reliability. And so this is why collecting videos of gestures is really important in gesture research so that we can do these types of checks. I can code the videos and someone else can code the videos, and we can confirm that we're actually comparing the same gesture types. So I first went to Wamba as a field assistant. I then, while I was there, was applying for my PhD at St. Andrews. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I got into my PhD, because I was talking with a master's student recently who asked me for some advice for applying for PhDs. And they had been applying through for advertised positions that they'd seen come up. And when I said that I contacted my PhD supervisor directly, they were really surprised. So one of the ways that you can approach PhD applications, if there's someone or several people that you're really interested in working with, you can email them, see if they're currently taking on PhD students. My undergrad advisor recommended that I take the approach in this email of framing it like, you're cool, I'm cool, let's be cool together. Like what research your potential supervisor is doing and why you appreciate that, what your own experience has been, and sort of how, and then finally how those overlap and some broad ideas for what you might be interested in. Because there is often funding through departments that you can then go on to apply together for. So that was what I did. I contacted my supervisor. He said yes, he was taking on PhD students and that he would support me in applying for funding. And so then I was able to go through that department funding application with him. Twitter is also really helpful for finding job adverts. And there's also websites like in the UK, it's jobs.ac.uk, but there are often academic job websites that you can check out that will have a specific section for PhD positions. So I started my PhD in 2013 and was really interested not only in the gesture types that bonobos use, but also in what those gestures mean and how do we study the meaning of gesture types. So it's quite, I mean, studying meaning is super interesting methodologically, and I could talk about it for a very long time. Historically, how people have looked at meaning in great ape gesture research has been to look at context. So looking at the signaler and saying, in what context did they give the signal? Were they playing? Were they feeding? Were they grooming? Like, what was the context that the gesture was given in? And taking that context as a sort of proxy for what the gesture is about. But if you think about any single one of those contexts, it's possible that an individual might have multiple goals in mind. They could be using gestures with many meanings. Like in a feeding context, I might be requesting food from someone. I might be telling someone to move away, telling someone to move closer, telling someone to stop that, like let's start playing. There are multiple different meanings that you could that could occur within these contexts. And so in my research, which is based on Kobater and Erica Cartmill's work, is to look at the outcome of the gesture. So after a signaler gives the gesture to a recipient, how does the recipient react? And how do they react in a way that seems to satisfy the signaler? And this gives us more specific meanings for the gestures. So an individual could be playing when they give the gesture, but then afterwards you see that the recipient has started to groom them. And so we're able to disentangle the context in which gestures occur from the specific meanings of those gestures. So a little example of what that looks like in practice. This bonobo gives a big, loud scratch gesture, and another bonobo comes in and starts grooming them. So we have the gesture in this instance was a big, loud scratch. The recipient came to start grooming them. The signaler indicated that they were satisfied by stopping gesturing. And so the meaning for this gesture in this instance would be initiate grooming. I have another video here with a group of bonobos. We're going to be looking at the two who are in the very middle of my screen right now. And so they're grooming, and then this female bonobo grabs the hair just above, just on the lower back of the male and pulls, and then they move together to a new location. And so this grab pull gesture, followed by the recipient's reaction of following them to a new location, would indicate that in this instance, that gesture was used to indicate follow me or let's move together, something like that. And so we're looking at the meanings in specific instances, and then by seeing many instances, we can start to build up a picture of what the gesture's meanings are overall, sort of a distribution of meanings. So to collect all of this data required a lot of field work. I was at Wamba for 12 months during my PhD. For the first field season, I had budgeted my studentship, which was about £13,000 a year. I budgeted my studentship so that I could afford to go to Wamba, the cost of which was around like 9,000 of that. So I really had to to live on a shoestring. And so for my second season, I was successful in getting a Venegren fieldwork grant, and that allowed me to collect more of the data that I needed. There are there's obviously quite big funders available for primatology, such as the Venegren Foundation and the Leakey Foundation, and those are places that you might want to apply for like long-term field work or data collection projects. There are also grants through the International Primatological Society, the American Society of Primatologists, the Association for the Study of Animal Behavior, the Animal Behavior Society, Primate Conservation Trust, American Society of Mammalogists, and alongside wildlife. So all of these have funding that can be used for your research. And I have shared the slides. So this whole slideshow, I have there's a link. I don't know if it's in the chat already. To so that
So sorry.
you can you can access the links to all of these funders. There are also some helpful funding lists. So in the notes on this slide, our research group has put together a list of funders and deadlines for those grants. But the Primate Society of Great Britain and the Royal Society of Biology both have lists for other grants. So like this is the slide for like where can you get your money to pay for your research. And like if any of you need any would like any advice for applying for any of these grants, I'm always happy to help looking over grant applications. All right, so we're getting back to what do belia gestures mean? So I've shown you the instances of like individual gesture instances and the outcomes they achieve. Now this is a look into the distribution of those meanings. So I'm going to talk you through this slide. On the x-axis we have types. These are the 33 gesture types for which I had enough data to assign meanings for them. The colors that are I'm going to reveal parts of the graph at different times, but the legend shows the different meanings that these gesture types achieved. And then it's going to show you the percentage of which each gesture type achieved each meaning. And sort of what I want you to take away from this slide is that half of the gesture types achieve a single meaning. So half of gesture types that achieve a single outcome in 100% of instances. So every single time I saw a mouth stroke gesture, it was followed by acquiring objects, so like acquiring food. Every single time I saw the big loud scratch gesture, it was to initiate grooming. Every single time I saw the push gesture, it was for move away. So these gesture types have really strict meanings for bonobos. But then there's this other half of the gestures that have ambiguous meanings. So they can mean like one of several things. And sometimes they just have two meanings, but sometimes they have like 7 different meanings. And so we seem to have this like variation in how ambiguous the meanings of gesture types are, which I'm going to come back to later because it's quite an interesting puzzle as to how individuals like understand and interpret one another when these gestures could have multiple meanings and do have multiple meanings. So what I did next from determinings of these gestures was to compare my work with the belia to Kat Hobater's work with chimpanzees, and to see what's the dictionary? Can we translate bonobo and chimpanzee gestures? Do they have similar meanings? Are they used for different meanings? So we put together this matrix, which has gestures along the y-axis and the meanings or apparently satisfactory outcomes along the x-axis. And each of the cells is colored. So if the cell is blank, then neither bonobos nor chimpanzees use this gesture for this outcome. If it's black, both chimpanzees and bonobos use this gesture for this outcome. If it's blue, only bonobos use this gesture for this outcome. And if it's green, only chimpanzees use this gesture for this outcome. So overall, most of the matrix cells are these white and black cells where like both chimpanzees and bonobos are either like they use it for this or they don't use it for this. This is the overlap, and it's very extensive. And I also think what's interesting here is that the gesture types that have the stricter meanings, so the gesture types that only have a single meaning or only have two meanings, seem to be the ones where the meanings overlap the most. And the gesture types that have ambiguous meanings, they're the ones that are overlapping less often. So I think that's really interesting. And I think it might have something to do with the way that context goes alongside meanings, and maybe some species differences in social behavior being in the ways that they use gestures. All right, so to test the similarities of bonobo and chimpanzee gestures, we then compared the bonobo and chimpanzee similarity, which is represented by this red line, to the bonobo matrix compared to 10,000 random iterations of the same matrix with different constraints. So at the top, we had constraints on both the row and column sums, so the numbers of ones and zeros that were in each row or each column, and all the way down to having no constraints. But the bonobos and chimpanzees were significantly more similar. So the similarity of bonobos and chimpanzees was significantly more than would be expected by random chance. So you can see that red line is very far from any of the random iterations. So this is super interesting, right? We have this communication system which overlaps around 90% in terms of gesture types. And it also seems that they're used for largely the same meanings. All right. So I went through funders who will fund your research, but I also wanted to signpost people to places. I've titled it Funding Yourself, and what I mean here is like funding your own living expenses and personal expenses, because we all know how challenging that can be. And while there are a lot of places out there that we can go to for our research expenses, sometimes like you just need to pay the rent and buy some groceries. So here, so the Animal Behavior Collective, Calvin mentioned that I'm one of the organizers in that collective. And we are working to provide micro grants for students in animal behavior. So you can apply. The application process is really simple. Our collective is based very much in the principles of trust and care and mutual aid. And so we just ask to use your institutional email or to provide some other form of evidence that you're a student. But other than that, we do not ask you to prove like that your financial need. Like we don't want your bank account statements. We don't want you to like justify to us why you need this money. This is money for you to have, like because you recognize your own need and we trust that. So we are based on and have like worked with the Black Trowel Collective and also Sportula, which are similar microgrants collectives for archaeology and for classics. And so if you're also archaeology relevant, that might be a place to look to. And there are also some places that will cover training and travel grants, which are also often underfunded. So the British Ecological Society and the Royal Society for Biology, they both have like smaller grants and smaller pots of money that you can apply to for training and for travel. I would also mention here that there are solidarity funds. So these are funds that are usually geographically located. So where I live in London, our borough has a solidarity fund. And so we organize to provide like amounts of £50 to people who need it. The microgrants model, the difference being that, it's geographically located rather than having to do with your work or your area of study. So that's somewhere that you can sometimes find additional income. And many universities also have hardship funds. So I was not aware of this, but until very recently. But if you look on your university website, you might be able to see if they have student hardship funds, because I know some of them do, and especially through the pandemic, these have been growing. So these are various places that you can find some extra money if you need it. Okay, so we've got these gestures that have multiple meanings, and the problem becomes, how do individuals understand gestures that have multiple meanings? Like, I'm giving a gesture to you, and this gesture could have one of 7 meanings. How do I know that you're going to choose the right meaning? How do you choose the right meaning? These are all sort of cognitive problems around having communication systems with this sort of flexibility and ambiguity. One of the ways that humans overcome this in our language is through syntax. So words that have multiple meanings, so homophonous or polysemous words that have multiple meanings. When used in a sentence, sometimes the way that sentence is ordered, or that that word's position and usage within this sequence of other words gives you more information about which meaning of the word I intended to use. So syntax is quite important for human communication in terms of disambiguating the words that we use. So one of the possibilities here is that Belia are also using sequences as a way of including gestures, or of specifying which meaning they intended to use, and for understanding the meanings of others' gestures. So I tested whether a gesture's presence in a sequence impacted its meaning. So whether a gesture was used singly, did it have the same meaning as a gesture used in a sequence? And whether that gesture's position in a sequence affected its meaning. So if I have an arm raise gesture that used at the beginning of a sequence versus an arm raise gesture used at the end of the sequence, do they have like consistently similar or consistently different meanings? And here's an example of what a bonobo gesture sequence might look like. So we have a male bonobo on the right, and he's going to gesture to this adult female bonobo on the left. I might actually play it a couple of times because it's a little fast. I should have anticipated that and slowed it down. So he sits and he presents his genitals, he raises his arm, and he thrusts back and forth. He sits and presents, raises his arm, and thrusts. So bonobos use gestures in sequences quite regularly, like particularly in sexual contexts, but also in play contexts. And so, yeah, you saw him use an arm raise gesture here, and we want to know whether that arm raise gesture might have a different meaning than it is used. And we did not find any evidence that a gesture used singly had a different meaning than a gesture used in a sequence. So we here they seemed to have similar distributions of meanings. So the gesture types on the left, sorry, they always had the same meaning, but these gesture types. So for instance, the fourth from the right, it had sort of the same distribution. So these gesture types have largely the same distributions of meanings, whether they're used singly or in a sequence. And same for the position in a sequence. Gesture types don't seem to have like consistently different meanings, whether they're used singly or in a sequence, and they also don't seem to have different meanings, whether they're used in the first, middle, or last position in a sequence. So probably not, like probably Belia are not using sequence order syntax to disambiguate the meanings of gestures. But I suppose with the caveat that, and something that we would like to look into further, is whether certain gesture types, when paired with another gesture type, do have, sorry, this gets into a whole load of syntactic organization, but whether, say, if I gave an arm raise gesture with a big loud scratch gesture, is that usually one thing versus if I give an arm raise gesture with a leg swing gesture? So whether the combination of specific gesture types might impact on the meaning of gestures. And that's something that will require massive data sets to test, but I think could potentially be one of the ways that they are disambiguating gesture types. And so hopefully as we sort of collect more data and collaborate on bigger projects together, we'll be able to answer those sort of more in-depth syntactic questions. All right. So I also wanted to touch upon mentorship because I know that it's something that's received a lot of attention recently, and it's an incredibly like helpful tool for connecting. Like it's really useful to connect with other people who have maybe gone through similar experiences, who study similar things, and to be able to chat through like your own thoughts about like what you're going to do for research, things that you would like to apply for, looking over your CV, those types of things. It is incredibly useful, but there's often information lacking about how we find mentors. And so I thought I would include this here. Um, so some universities do have their own mentorship schemes, or like a collection of universities might collaborate together. So St Andrews, where I am, works with a couple of other Scottish universities, and they sort of organize a mentorship scheme for Scottish students. So that's always worth looking into, whether your university has anything like that. There are also specific groups who organize mentorship. So the Animal Behavior Collective that I mentioned before, we organize mentorship. We so far have 120 mentors signed up, and we've matched about 60 students with mentors. I think another 20 are pending right now. So you can always apply to us. And we, they're sort of two Google forms that's filled in by mentors and one that's filled in by mentees. And both say what kind of things either they would like to mentor on or what kind of things they would like to receive mentorship for. And then we're able to match people based on their priorities. And so far that's been going really well. There is also Muse. So this is the mentorship for underrepresented STEM enthusiasts. And this is a mentorship program specifically for students or people in STEM who are from underrepresented or historically excluded groups. So that's a really useful mentorship program to reach out to. I would also add that you can email someone who you'd like to chat to. I know it can be a bit nerve-wracking to reach out to someone, but I get emails. I've had quite a few emails this year, and that have led to like me having video calls with students to chat about their PhD application, to talk about like research ideas, to check over their CV. And I'm always happy to talk to people. And I'm sure that a lot of the other like postdocs and lecturers and professors in this seminar are also like really happy to talk to you. So you can always email someone and reach out to them. And there are lots of people who are willing to offer their support. So we've gone through the syntax-like sequence order. Does it impact meaning? Generally not. Like for Belia, it doesn't seem to impact upon their the meanings of their gestures. One of the other possibilities, and one of the other ways humans understand one another's ambiguous words is with context. So context being sort of the situation that you're in, the like gathering information around you from what's happened before, from how you relate to another individual, to what has been said recently. So there's a whole lot of information that goes into context, which can make it very messy to study, and which is why here I've specifically looked at two sort of subcategories of context. So I've looked at behavioral context, which is the behavior, and here I've just looked at the behavior of the signaler before they've given a gesture. So what was the signaler doing immediately before they gestured? And the interpersonal context. So these are demographic attributes. What is the sex and rank of both signaler and recipient relate to one another? In this with the data set that I had, I was able to look at age and sex of individuals, but not rank. But that would be it would be really interesting to be able to look at rank and also social networks in general as they pertain to gestural communication. So when we consider behavioral context and we look at these ambiguous gesture types, the gesture types disambiguate. So there's two gesture types that become fully disambiguated when you consider the context, so the behavior of the signaler before gesturing. But all of the gesture types become disambiguated in at least one context. So it really looks like what the signaler was doing at the time they gave the gesture adds additional information to that communication. And so specific gesture types in specific contexts have specific meanings. So when we look at the gestures that remain ambiguous, that still have multiple meanings in a given context, and we consider the sex and the age of an individual, of the individual's signaler and recipients, it disambiguates further. And so there were many gesture types that were fully disambiguated when we considered whether it was a female communicating with a male, a female communicating with a female, or a male communicating with a male. And the two that failed to disambiguate, one of them then disambiguated whether it was an adult gesturing to a young individual or a young individual gesturing to an adult. So this is still quite early on in sort of considering context as it pertains to gesture meanings. The data sets that are required for this type of analysis are huge. So I will say that here I've been able to mostly only do like chi-squared and Fisher's exact tests for statistics, because by the time we look at a given gesture type in a given context and a given meaning, we're narrowing ourselves down to really sort of small numbers of instances that we have. And so what's really exciting about the project that I'm currently working on with Dr. Kat Hobater is that we're collaborating with a lot of other researchers and have access to a lot more video footage, and will hopefully be able to get more gestures out of it to be able to sort of dig more deeply and get more satisfactory answers about context and its effects on meaning. But it does look like the context in which gestures are given disambiguates the meanings of the gestures themselves. Okay. So hopefully the job boards and the funding bodies and the mentorship and the different resources that I've shared throughout this talk have been helpful. I also want to repeat that just how unjust our institutions are, and that even with putting in all this work, doing your best for funding, you then come out the other side, you're applying for jobs, it's incredibly difficult. I'm in a 3-year contract now, and will be looking to apply one day to permanent positions, I suppose. But there's a lot that's stacked against early career academics. And our institutions really do have to change. So a lot of what I've been talking about has been resources to help you get through this early part of your academic journey. And I hope that they are helpful. But for those of us who do make it out the other side and who do get jobs in academia, it's really our responsibility to make things better for our junior comrades. Things like becoming active union members, becoming a mentor, redistributing some of our wealth to initiatives that support students' financial needs and the financial needs of neighbours in our communities. We need to consider the practices in our own research groups and departments, interrogating the data that we collect, how we collect it, and who benefits from this whole process. And we need to support student activists and listen to and center the experiences of historically excluded people. So moving on to the summarization portion. The question, so I've covered a lot of Belia research, a bit of chimpanzee research. There is evidence also of intentional communication in other great apes. And intentional communication not only in terms of the gestures, but in terms of vocalizations. We're getting more and more evidence that vocalizations may be produced intentionally. But there's also evidence of intentional communication in other primate species as well. So in baboons, howler monkeys, macaques, siamangs, and as we expand the gesture research that is done, we're also finding gestural communication in a lot of these species. And I hope that there are some students here who will go on to study gestural communication in other species, because we're very great ape focused, and it would be excellent to get out of that and to see what other primates are doing. Because yeah, the cognitive focus often tends to be on great apes, when really we other primates could be doing cool things with their gestures too. When we look a little further afield as well, there's evidence of intentional communication in birds, like in Arabian babblers. There's some evidence that fish may communicate intentionally. So really, beyond primates, this is incredibly interesting as well. And yeah, I just find it an incredibly fascinating research topic. And when we look to the gestures that I've talked about today, so I mentioned that there is the overlap of between 88 and 96% between chimpanzees and Belia, who separated around 1 million years ago as species. But there's also a 60% overlap with gorillas, who diverged between 6 and 8 million years ago. And there's also an 80% overlap between chimpanzees and orangutans, who diverged even further back, at 12 to 16 million years ago. So this is also like a huge argument for studying gestural communication in other more distantly related primate species, because if we're seeing these large overlaps among the great apes, it's likely that we'll see them in other primate species as well. And I added humans here too, because obviously we use gestures. Like as I mentioned near the beginning of my talk, we use gestures really frequently. They're super important, not only for how we communicate, but also for how we think. And being able to tie humans in to this great ape picture would be really interesting. And we've started to do that a little bit with studies on young infants and toddlers. So there's evidence suggesting that children under 2 years of age have around, I think it was around an 80% overlap with the chimpanzee gesture repertoire. And we're also trying to test, like, use online experiments to test adult human and understanding of great ape gestures. So I think there's some really exciting ways that we can approach the human gesture question. And I'm always interested to hear more ideas about that if you have any. All right. So to wrap this all up, so great apes use gestures and they use them intentionally. And chimpanzees and bonobos share most of their gesture types. So as I've said, chimpanzees and belia have 90% overlap of gesture types, which also begs the question how gestures are acquired and whether there is sort of an aspect of them that is biologically inherited. Chimpanzees and belia gestures share many of the same meanings, again adding evidence to this suggestion that there is something about there may be something biologically inherited or something about their body plan and also the goals that they have and the contexts in which they use gestures that is so similar that they have not only overlapping gesture types but also overlapping gesture meanings. Gesture meanings, gestures that seem to have multiple meanings also have, so they have specific meanings in different contexts. So where sequences, so a presence or absence in a sequence, or position in a sequence, failed to disambiguate the meanings of gestures, we found that behavioral context and interpersonal context did. So bonobos are using, so bonobo gestures have specific meanings in specific contexts. And to leave that question of where humans fit into the great ape gesture picture, I think it's really interesting and that we're going to be finding out a lot more about it. I guess I would also add in this primate conference that it is just interesting to know what these species are communicating about, like, for themselves, and it's interesting in its own right just to think about the kinds of things that they're communicating about, the ways in which gestures are used, those types of things. All right, thank you so much. Again, I end with a little reminder on my thank you slide to check out all of the initiatives. I've also added a couple of others. So there's LGBTQ plus field network, which have really useful information and resources for any LGBTQ plus field researchers. So things to consider. And there's also the Animal Behavior Community Africa, who are doing a lot of work for supporting animal behavior researchers in Africa. So I would encourage you all to check out all of these resources. I've also included my email address, so if you do want to contact me with any questions, please feel free. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Graham. That was amazing. I think I'd speak on behalf of every student in here that we're very grateful that you talked about, getting involved like professionally in primate research. I know personally that's very helpful information. So thank you for that. And I guess now kind of wanted to shift to questions until we finish up. Um, so first, to start off, we got a question from Sarah in the chat earlier, and it's can chimps and bonobos communicate with each other using gestures? Do they understand one another even though they're different species?
We would say in principle, yes. So this, like all of this research suggests that if a bonobo and a chimpanzee were to meet, they would be able to understand one another's gestures. They live in different ranges, and so they don't meet in the wild. They used to meet in captivity because Belio were not recognized as separate species for quite a while. And so we think that they were housed with chimpanzees for quite a long time before recognizing they were separate species. Presumably they were communicating then, but we didn't know it. So yeah, in principle, they would be able to communicate.
Awesome, and just feel free to raise your hand if you got any questions or type in chat.
I was unmuted. Can I go?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. First, I wanted to comment that I got matched with a mentor through the ABC network, and it was really helpful. So if anyone else is thinking about doing that, highly recommend. But I had a question about what you think about gestures that may not have meaning. So, as humans, we gesture all the time without necessarily having a communicative meaning, especially as a producer. If we're speaking orally, it's hard for us to not wave our hands. Do you think all gestures are definitely going to have a meaning, in these apes, or do you think it's possible that like lip smacking while grooming may not actually be communicative, but more just co-activation?
Oh, sorry, I think my internet dropped out at the end there. But yeah, so this might be a long-winded answer, but so obviously the way that we are looking at meanings is by looking at a behavioral mean, and so not going to be able to capture all meanings. So I think that the point of gestures is that they do have meanings, but those meanings must be requests for a change behavior. So we're trying to get at meaning by seeing what we can observe in the great apes. And so what we can observe is their change in behavior after the gesture. And so we are finding gestures, we're like selecting for gestures that have meanings that are a request to change behavior. But I absolutely think that there are gestures, there are almost definitely gestures for like stay, like keep doing that, like stay where you are. We wouldn't be able to pick that up because the individual would just like keep doing what they were doing. They would stay where they are. We also wouldn't be able to pick up any declarative gestures if those existed. So if a chimpanzee were just gesturing about like it's a nice day outside, this tree is very pretty, we wouldn't expect there to be a behavioral change for those gestures, and like we wouldn't pick up on those meanings. So I think that there probably are meanings that our current methodology doesn't allow us to pick up on.
Well, it looks like I got a question from Christina in the chat. Do you think gestural repertoires would differ much depending on environmental context, such as captive versus wild, and has this comparative work been conducted before?
I do, and I don't think that there have been direct comparisons. I think what's interesting actually is that a lot of the research on gesture acquisition, so how do gestures emerge during development, a lot of that has been, the focus has been in captivity and in captive settings. And then in terms of like cataloging a whole repertoire like this research, that has mostly been done with wild great apes. And so there has tended to be a kind of a difference in the approaches to like research questions. that people have taken with captive and wild great apes in terms of their gestures. And so the repertoire sizes that we see in captivity are sometimes smaller. And so then the question is whether that is because they don't have the same variety of contexts as they do in the wild, whether it's because the researchers have had different focuses. So I think a direct comparison would be really interesting. Also, great apes, like in captivity, seem to be quite capable of picking up new gestures from people, from the keepers who work with them. They will pick up gestures that they use like specifically with humans. And so that's kind of, in some ways, their gesture in captivity is more limited, but in some ways, they're doing other interesting things with their communication.
Awesome. We've got a question from Jenna. Is it frustrating to study a species that is so closely compared to chimpanzees? Does it make things harder, easier?
Um, I mean, bonobos are so cool. Like I love Belia so much. I don't think I've ever been frustrated studying them. Um, it is interesting. I think also like in terms of chimpanzees and bonobos, they sometimes are so similar. They're like so similar to humans, but not similar enough, if that makes sense, in terms of a lot of research questions. And so there are a lot of things where when you're comparing your research to like developmental psychology, there are things that developmental psychologists will get away with in terms of saying that like this human infant looking into their mother's eyes indicates that it is intentional communication, where when primatologists apply that same criteria, it isn't adequate. And so I think that's sort of one of those, the proximity to humans is both helpful and sometimes frustrating, I would say, more so than chimpanzees. I'm also super excited to be part of a project that is like we're collaborating with various chimpanzee field sites. And so I'm gaining a lot of appreciation about the variation within chimpanzees, and like West African chimpanzees doing their cool stuff, Central African chimpanzees doing their cool stuff. I think that's really interesting.
Awesome. I had kind of my own question, clarifying question, I guess. So when so when you're talking about like the syntax, the sequencing of the behaviors or of the gestures, that doesn't necessarily indicate anything, but if we're just talking about so the gestures, does the existence of other gestures, like does its existence in a sequence, not necessarily its context in the sequence, but does its mere existence in a sequence change its meaning at all?
No, it doesn't. So yeah, whether a gesture like is used on its own or in a sequence, like its existence in a sequence, doesn't change the meaning. Um, I was going to add something about sequence. One of the ways in which sequences might be used is to add emphasis to something. So like I mentioned earlier that there were more sequences for bonobos in sexual solicitation and in play initiation. So like context in which like the signaler is like really excited about what they are gesturing about, and are putting a lot of energy and emphasis into it. And so one of the questions is like whether they are using gestures that are sort of, they're using multiple gestures that mean the same thing to like emphasize their point. That's like, play with me, like play with me, play with me, rather than each of those gestures having like their own meaning.
Thank you. Looks like we have a question from Jesse. How many of the gestures do you estimate to be genetically passed on or inherited, if you can call it that? And how many do you estimate are learned through interactions with surroundings and others?
So I'm working on a theoretical at the moment with Rich Moore and Federico Zano. And it's kind of, we're trying to put together a list of predictions for what we would expect if gestures were being learned through ontogenetic ritualization or other types of social learning, or whether they were being inherited. But we are proposing sort of a third option, which is that gestures may represent like an action schema that is they're not iconic, but they make sense for the action that you're requesting. So like a big loud scratch is like very similar to like itching yourself because like you want like because you have like stuff in your hair. Or like an arm raise gesture for an infant, like it's very similar to like what you would do if you were climbing onto your mother or reaching to be like picked up. And so we're sort of like this this is very early stages, but we're sort of putting together predictions for these three different models where they're learned, they're like there's some genes for all these gestures, or it's sort of an artifact of us having similar body plans, similar goals, similar social lives, and these are the actions that make sense to communicate all that. So that's sort of where we're going with that. I think also in terms of like variation by community, it's interesting that the gestures that use objects seem to have more variation by community, which maps quite nicely onto tool use as well. So the gesture types that in terms of the overlap that I showed earlier, like I don't know if you picked up on it, but there was bonobos do a leaf drop gesture, chimpanzees do a clip gesture, chimpanzees do a lot more drumming on different things. So I think in terms of their object use in relation to gestures, that could be an area where there is some community variation.
Awesome. And I had another question for you, if that's cool. So the great apes are obviously endangered, all of them. So, and I'm just wondering if you had any resources or knew of any resources where we could, from our own homes at least, contribute to bonobo or just general great ape conservation.
Yeah, so Wamba, where I did my research, so if you search for Wamba Committee for Bonobo Research on their website, so they organize like, or they they help to fund community projects, um, which like is a huge part of conservation. So they're a good place. Lola Ya Bonobo is an obvious one. So they're the Bonobo Suri in Kinshasa. And they also, so they rescue orphan bonobos. They have like a reintroduction. They have a parcel, or they reintroduce bonobos to this portion of forest. There's also some work going on, I think, like in terms of broader conservation, it's sometimes trickier. Like there's the danger to do the colonial, let's put a fence around it and keep people out. And so I'm cautious to recommend bigger conservation organizations that are that's their approach. And so yeah, I think those would be my two suggestions.
Awesome, thank you. And if anybody has any questions, just text it in the chat, or I should be able to see your if you raise your hand. So I'll unmute you. And another one from Jesse here. What are your thoughts on Kanzi the bonobo and his abilities?
That's super interesting. I think of all of the like ape language apes, Kanzi is probably the one that we have the most like existing video recordings and data from, because I know that there's been a reticence to share video and data from some of the others, perhaps out of a fear that they wouldn't be so so magical as like purported. But I think it's super interesting because like it reflects their ability to pick up on new communication signals. It sort of, I think it gets at a lot of the cognitive questions around great ape communication, which is interesting. It's like, I suppose it's quite a weird, it's quite weird to think about in terms of like, I think these studies have given us some answers and some insights, but they were never ethical. And we're never going to do studies like this again. And so we then have like a very small sample size groups who have been trained like this. So it's super complicated. And I think that like we have learned a lot in terms of Kanzi's cognition. But in terms of general applicability, it might be somewhat limited.
Awesome. Do we have any more questions from anybody? Ashton, are you getting any in your?
No, I was just checking.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Oh, looks like we have one from Caroline. Do gesture meanings vary in the form of the gesture in Velia or different groups of Velia? Also, does gesture type or sequence meaning vary based on the social bonds of individuals in the social network in Velia?
Oh my goodness, I love all of these people who are setting up for like new theoretical papers that I'm working on right now. So I'm working on a paper with some other collaborators in St. Andrews on taking like a socio-ecological perspective of great ape gestures, because yeah, like a lot of our work so far has focused on the level of the individual and whether an individual's like genetics and experiences impact on their gestures. But there are so many questions like this to be answered in terms of, yeah, social bonds, groups with different social structures, whether the differences in social structures between species affects the like patterns of gesturing that we see sort of as species differences. I think a lot of these questions, rather than looking at gesture types, we might want to be looking at gesture rates. So in terms of like whether there are, so we have this gestures or these sort of like possible action schema, these possible ways that we could be asking for something. Are there like, does your rank or your relationship to another individual affect which of those gestures from your repertoire you select? Are there group preferences to use a certain gesture where like both of the groups use an arm shake gesture, but one of the groups use an arm shake gesture way more than the other group? For gestures that have multiple meanings, especially, like whether there are preferences in terms of like, I use this gesture most of the time for this meaning, this gesture most of the time for this meaning. So I think in terms of like group variation, variation by social bonds, by social structures, also like, yeah, to bring in the ecological side of it, like what habitat are you living in? Like what is the visibility? Are you a mostly arboreal orangutan who's using their hands most of the time for climbing and might not be able to do like bimanual gestures? Maybe you're using your legs more often. different sort of students around a variation of gestures that way. Sorry, I dropped that.
Awesome. Yeah, we have a few more questions here. So from Melissa is asking if you could elaborate on why the word bilia is preferred over bonobos. Is this something that bonobo researchers would like to see used among all bonobo keepers, enthusiasts, or even general population?
So in my slides, I reference a paper by Nishida and let me pull it up. By Kano and Nishida, using bilia as an authentic vernacular name. So this was also, so this paper is from 1999. It's written at a point where bonobo research is picking up a bit more. There are more people writing about bonobos, but some people were still calling them pygmy chimpanzees. And there was like a lot of debate around naming. And the suggestion that this paper makes is that when you talk about bonobos to also like include bilia. So in my publications, I have like referenced bilia alongside the scientific name Panpaniscus. I don't think like in terms of the whole scientific community, bonobo is so well known that I doubt to change it to using bilia. But as part of like recognizing where the species lives and like that they had a name and people who lived in this area had a name for bonobos before like this one person shipped a specimen of bonobos from the town called Bolobo. So yeah, so that like that recognition is an important step. But yeah, you don't have to like replace every time you use bonobo, but it's really nice to include it where you can.
Skip is asking, what do you think about ecotourism opportunities to see bonobos in the DRC? Possible? Is it possible or helpful?
Well, so at the moment, tourists who get to see bonobos are incredibly rich. So if people want to see bonobos in the wild, they have to have a lot of money, um, and so that's like that's really it's something
You're kind of cutting out a little bit.
Hi, yes.
I don't know if that's the case for anybody else. Sorry. Sorry.
No, I noticed that I cut out.
You're
I'll
good now.
start that again. Yeah. So in the south of the Bonobo Range, it's closer to bigger like towns and cities. And so there might be some areas like I think it's Malebo, where I think it's WWF are working with some other researchers to habituate bonobos for ecotourism. I'm not sure. I am not an expert in ecotourism, and it makes me feel, yeah, it makes me feel kind of uncomfortable. I think like in terms of protecting a species, it would be nice if we were able to put resources into it without having to go to visit the species. But there are probably far more qualified people who would be able to answer sort of to the positives of ecotourism because yeah, that's not my area of expertise.
Kai asks, by the way, sorry if I'm like mispronouncing anybody's name. Is the use of gestures or the repertoire size linked to intelligence?
Ooh, potentially. I suppose that like expanding it to other species would be an interesting way of looking at that. because I suppose like for humans, gestures is so linked with other cognitive abilities. Like there's such strong evidence about gestures being used as like cognitive tools as well. Like for like memory, I don't know if you've ever walked around your house like looking for a pair of scissors and you're like, what was I? Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Or like describing things, being able to visualize. Yeah, so I think the ways that in which gesture, language, and cognition have like all come alongside one another um, suggests that they are probably linked in other great apes as well.
India says, I would love to hear what your best line of advice would be for a first-year animal behavior degree student. Is there anything you wish you could have told your past self?
Um, I I was thinking about this in terms of like going into my PhD, but I think that it probably goes for like any students in animal behaviors. Is sort of like I realized that I relied a lot on my supervisors and lecturers and people like in positions of power to um tell me like what was safe and what wasn't safe. And like in terms of risk assessments, I think in animal behavior and in field work in particular, there's a huge like it's really problematic the types of risks that students are expected to take and that researchers are expected to take. And there's sort of machismo behind field work and like how much weight you expect to lose during field work and like how hard it is and like what injuries have you had and like all of these things that like you don't need to buy into that. Like I wish that I had like I don't know to just like go back and kick myself in the butt and be like, okay, do you think this is a reasonable risk to be taking? Like is there someone else who might be able to give me more information, like say like what is it like as like a queer person traveling, like what are the extra things that I need to know about, or like in terms of like personal health, like what are the other things that I need to consider, and not just like, oh, it'll be fine. Like I just take a like sandwich into the field and like my binoculars and a notebook. Like, no, you take a first aid kit with you too. Like I think around risk and safety and like really making sure that you feel safe at all times, like in all regards. I would go back and tell myself that.
Caroline has another question, and that is, have you seen a difference, or have you seen a difference if Bilia were to integrate into a new group? Do they effortlessly communicate, or do they adjust their gestures?
Yeah, well, I actually think that like that immigration into other groups is a really useful time to look at communication. Um, and I think that would be a really nice study. I think particular like this is where collaboration comes in, right? Because there are I've worked with researchers who have specifically looked um, at females before, during, and after like moving to a new group. And so like being able to collaborate with researchers like that who have that video anyway. My impression is that they integrate really well, like they're using the same like Novo females are like so central to the group, and immigrant females like become such a part of the social group so quickly, um, which is really impressive. And I think also like in terms of species differences, that female centrality might represent one of the species differences with chimpanzees, in terms of the gestures that we're seeing female bonobos using. We don't always see those gestures being used by female chimpanzees.
Awesome. It looks like I'm out of questions in the chat right now, but I'll still wait a few seconds just to see if there's any more questions that come rolling in, we kind of conclude here.
Oh, I'll put my email in the chat too if anyone needs that.
Yes, great idea. And yeah, just to as a reminder, I did include the link to Dr. Graham's presentation, like her actual PowerPoint, and that has some useful info in terms of videos and other like contacts and stuff. So that should be in the presenter's notes, and I recommend downloading it as a PowerPoint to read those presenter notes. Yeah, it looks like we're all done. No more questions. So thank you so much, Dr. Graham. That was amazing and very informative. And I just want to let everybody know that our next talk is at 11 a.m. Pacific time with Dr. Lydia Hooper. So hopefully we'll see you guys there.
Thank you.
Thank you.